When did your siblings finally come crawling back for help? I survived a massive chemical fire at 20, but the flames won in their own way. I will never taste food again. The nerve damage that scarred me also robbed me of the only future I'd ever truly wanted, to be a chef. I have 3 siblings who always treated me like I was broken, even before the accident. Too fragile to handle the heat of a real kitchen, too weak to be taken seriously. When I was in the burn ward, they'd visit in shifts, staying just long enough to take selfies in their pristine chef coats. Never long enough for the agonizing work. Now I am 32, capable, and deeply knowledgeable. But to them, I am still that damaged girl who shouldn't accept much. For a decade, I lived for my siblings' restaurant empire. When my brother opened his first bistro, I pulled all-nighters balancing the acidity in his signature sauces, using pure chemical theory because he was hungover. I memorized supplier contracts, calculated hydration ratios, and never missed an inventory shift. 5 restaurants between 3 siblings, and I was the ghost in the machine. I knew every health code and every profit margin. While my siblings attended galas or jetted off to retreats, I trained their line cooks, walk-ins, and wrote menus from scratch based entirely on texture and molecular science. I drove halfway across the state to secure a rare truffle vendor while my sister had a spa day. I covered frantic Friday dinner rushes while my older brother was getting interviewed. Every grand opening, I arrived at dawn to prep and stayed until closing to balance the books. The prep cooks started cooking me first when a dish broke. The silent chef understands, they'd say. Last month, my sister Vivian asked me to come to the flagship restaurant. Important corporate restructuring, she emailed. I arrived carrying the seasonal menus I'd been perfecting since autumn. The room felt like an interrogation chamber. All 3 siblings sitting across a massive oak table. 1 empty chair. Vivian slid a manila folder across the wood. We are buying out your shares because your presence in the kitchen has become a liability. My brother Theodore jumped in. You adjust recipes without consulting us. You undermine our authority. The line cooks ask you for direction constantly, Vivian said, jaw tight. The sous chef asked if you were the executive chef last week. That is just because I started. You are weirdly obsessed with our kitchen, muttered Ashford. It is uncomfortable. You need to find your own hobby instead of stealing our legacy, Vivian sighed. Look, some people are meant to be culinary leaders. The way you hover around our stoves proves you cannot accept reality. You cannot even taste the food. You are too pathetic, too clinging. We have a major review coming up. You are permanently banned from our property. The staff needs to respect their actual chefs without you confusing them. We are doing this for your own good, Theodore added. Maybe without our restaurants as a crutch. Finally accept your disability. I sat there for 30 seconds for roughly hours, then walked out over. At home, my boyfriend Edmund found me staring blankly out the window. He held me while I poured out the nightmare. Come down to my cafe tomorrow, he said. Please. The next morning at Edmund's Corner Bakery was intimidating. I usually hid behind the scenes, but his lead baker called in sick. Within minutes, I was rescuing a failed batch of sourdough by strictly reading the dough he left with me. Edmund's father watched from the counter. She is an absolute savant, he told Edmund. During the rush, an older regular asked who was managing the ovens. When Edmund quietly explained my accident, his father placed a hand on my shoulder. Honey, watching you command that kitchen today was poetry. A working palate does not make a chef. Pure passion does. I excused myself to the alley, crying happy tears. When I checked my screen, my phone was exploding with alerts. Vivian calling repeatedly. When I answered, her voice was hysterical. What did you do? You have ruined our career. I was completely lost. What? I haven't been there in weeks. The health inspector is shutting down the east wing because the logs are missing. The line cooks walked out. Theodore ruined the duck hunt. The main investor is pulling our funding right now. My stomach commented. Wait, Vivian, you banned me. You all said I was pathetic and a liability. The line went silent. Then the investor's booming voice came through. He had taken her phone. They said what? I explained the ambush. The words how they called me a desperate cripple and locked me out of the empire I maintained. Get down here immediately. Edmund and I pulled up to the flagship location an hour later. The alley doors swung open. The entire kitchen staff was sitting on milk crates, refusing to work. I looked past them to see my siblings standing near the stove. Vivian rushed forward to hand me an apron, but the lead investor stepped firmly between us. Look at this disaster, the investor said coldly. This kitchen has been failing for weeks without her. He turned to my siblings. She is the only real chef in this family. She takes over the entire group, or I am pulling every single dollar tonight. The heat in the alley was thick with the smell of old grease and garbage, a sharp contrast to the cold air inside the flagship kitchen. Arthur Sterling, the primary financial backer of the entire hospitality group, did not look at my sister as she tried to extend the blue linen apron toward me. His eyes remained fixed on Theodore, whose face had gone from pale to a deep mottled red. Take it, Vivian hissed under her breath, her hand shaking slightly as she held the fabric out. Just put it on, Nora. We can talk about the paperwork later. I didn't reach for it. I looked at the frayed hem of my jeans, then up at Arthur. The line cooks on the milk crates had gone dead silent. Marcus, the grill lead who had been with us since the second bistro opened on 4th Street, spat a toothpick onto the gravel. She hasn't touched a logbook in 3 weeks, Marcus said, leaning back against the brick wall. You told us she was taking a medical leave because she couldn't handle the pressure anymore, Vivian. Then we find out you locked her out of the shared drive. That's internal family business, Theodore snapped, his voice cracking slightly. He wiped his hands on his pristine white chef coat, leaving a streak of orange fat from the ruined duck confit down the front. Marcus, get your people back inside. The health inspector gave us 2 hours to produce the temperature logs for the walk-in, or the gates stay down for the weekend. The logs aren't in the office because you didn't print them, I said. My voice sounded flat, even to me. I used to pull them from the digital receivers every Tuesday at 5 a.m. before the delivery trucks arrive. The receiver in the east wing has a faulty Bluetooth card. You have to manually bridge the IP address on the local terminal. Otherwise, it overwrites the previous 7 days. I told you that in August, Theodore. It's on the laminated sheet by the ice machine. Theodore blinked, his mouth opening slightly. The laminated sheet was thrown away when we repainted, he muttered. Arthur Sterling let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like a cough. He reached into his tailored coat pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen, tapping it against his palm. 2 hours, he said, looking at Vivian. That means the Friday dinner service is already dead. The theater crowd starts arriving at 5:30. We have 82 covers booked for the first seating alone. If those doors don't open, the food critic from the Chronicle goes somewhere else. I spent 6 months pulling strings to get him into this dining room tonight. We can execute the menu, Vivian insisted, her voice rising an octave. She stepped closer to Arthur, completely ignoring me now. Ashford is at the Midtown location right now, but he can be here in 20 minutes. He knows the plating for the sea base. We don't need a full audit right now. Nora can just look at the terminal and fix the digital log so the inspector clears us. It's not just a digital log, Vivian, I said. The inspector is there because the temp in the low boy under the guard manger station has been fluctuating between 42 and 46 degrees for 4 days. I know because the automated alert pinged my personal email this morning before you revoked my administrative access. The compressor line has a slow leak. If Marcus puts raw oysters in that low boy at 46 degrees, you're going to poison 30 people before the soup course even goes out. Arthur turned his head slowly to look at me, his gray eyebrows pulled together. You knew about the compressor from your house? I check the hardware diagnostics every morning with my coffee, I said. It took 10 minutes. It saved us $6,000 in lost inventory last quarter alone. Arthur looked back at Vivian. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked disgusted. The kind of disgust that comes when a businessman realizes he's been paying for a luxury sedan and received a cardboard cutout instead. The agreement I signed with your father before he passed stated that the operational integrity of the group would remain intact, Arthur said softly. He didn't raise his voice, but every line cook on the crate leaned forward to hear him. I thought that meant the three of you who went to culinary school were the ones maintaining it. I didn't realize you were using your sister as an unpaid deposit. She has a 30% stake, Theodore said defensively. She's not unpaid. You bought her out an hour ago, Arthur countered. Or rather, you tried to. I haven't released the capital for the Q3 expansion yet, which means the funds we used for that buyout offer came from the main operational account. The account that's supposed to cover the payroll taxes next Tuesday. The silence that followed was total, save for the hum of the exhaust fans from the kitchen next door. Vivian's hand finally dropped, the apron folding over her wrist. She looked at Theodore, her eyes wide with a sudden sharp panic that had nothing to do with health inspections or ducking fit. Theodore, you said Arthur cleared the transfer, she whispered. Theodore looked away, focusing intently on a grease stain near the back door. The market was closing, he said defensively. We had to move the shares before the corporate filing deadline, or the structure would have stayed locked until next year. I was going to call Arthur on Monday. You're a fool, Theodore, Arthur said. He turned to me, his expression softening by a fraction of an inch. Nora, come inside. Let's look at this kitchen. I hesitated. I looked at Edmund, who was still standing by the back bumper of his car, his apron from the bakery still tied around his waist. He gave me a small, firm nod. Go, he murmured. I'll wait here. The interior of the flagship kitchen was a disaster area. On paper, it was a state-of-the-art facility with stainless steel surfaces and digital inventory screens. In reality, it smelled like scorched sugar and old oil. A pan of reduced balsamic had been left on the back burner, completely carbonized, sending a thin ribbon of bitter gray smoke toward the hood. The health inspector, a tired-looking man named Miller, whom I'd given coffees every 3 months for 5 years, was sitting at the small metal desk by the dry storage room. He had his laptop open and a clipboard balanced on his knee. When he saw me walk in, he stood up, his shoulders dropping in visible relief. Nora, Miller said, shaking his head. Thank God. These two have been screaming at me about corporate overreach for 40 minutes. I told them 3 times. I don't care about their brand identity. I care about the fact that the walk-in log is a blank PDF and the line station is running hot. Give me 5 minutes, Mr. Miller, I said. I walked over to the terminal near the dish pit. The screen was sticky with something sweet, probably the lime syrup Theodore used for the sorbet base. I pulled a clean side towel from the sanitizing bucket, wiped my fingers, and tapped through the system override. The local network card was fried, just as I thought. The data hadn't been deleted. It was just stuck in the cache, waiting for a valid gateway handshake. I opened the command prompt, forced a hard reset on the local IP, and watched the lines of temperature data populate across the screen from Tuesday through Friday. All green, except for the guard manger low boy. I printed the log and handed the warm paper to Miller. The low boy has been empty since noon, I told him. I flagged the compressor on Tuesday. We've been using the main walk-in for the raw protein. The line cooks just haven't shifted the prep trays back because the station assignment sheet wasn't updated this morning. Miller scanned the numbers, checking the timestamps against his own digital probe readings. He nodded slowly, pulling out his pen to sign off on the compliance sheet. This clears the closure order, Nora. But that compressor needs execution before you pack it with shellfish for the weekend. If I come back on Monday and see 46 degrees again, I'm pulling the license on the spot. It'll be fixed by 6 p.m., I said. As Miller walked out the back door, Vivian and Theodore stepped into the narrow space between the prep tables. Vivian's face had settled into a look of cold, calculating calculation. She had always been the one who handled the public relations, the one who knew exactly how to phrase an apology so it sounded like a victory. Okay, she said, crossing her arms. So the log is fixed. We'll call the back guy. Nora, thank you for coming down. Obviously, things got a little chaotic after the meeting this morning, but we can honor the original buyout terms with an extra 5% for the trouble. Arthur Sterling stepped out from the shadows near the walk-in door. He hadn't left. He had been standing there, watching my fingers move across the terminal keyboard, watching how the tension in the room shifted the moment I entered. You aren't buying anything, Vivian, Arthur said. He took the signed compliance sheet from the desk and tucked it into his pocket. The buyout is void. The operational funds were used without board approval. As of right now, I am exercising the emergency receivership clause in our financing agreement. Theodore turned white. You can't do that. That clause is only for insolvency. Your main kitchen was just shut down by the state for 40 minutes due to gross administrative neglect during a major review week, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. That is operational insolvency. If I pull my capital, the Midtown location defaults on its lease by Monday noon. The bank takes the equipment on Wednesday. You have 3 days before the whole house of cards collapses. He looked at me. I want her in charge of the entire corporate structure, not just the books, the menus, the hiring, the scheduling, the supply chain, everything. Vivian let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a choke. In charge? Arthur, she can't even taste the salt in the water. How is she supposed to run 5 high-end kitchens if she doesn't know if the soup is seasoned? She knew the low boy was at 46 degrees from 3 miles away while you were standing right next to it smelling burnt vinegar, Arthur said. He stepped closer to me, his eyes searching my face. Nora, do you want the group? I looked around the kitchen. I looked at the copper pots hanging from the rack, pots I had polished myself when we couldn't afford a night cleaner. I looked at the recipe sheets taped to the wall, written in my own neat, small handwriting, every measurement calculated down to the gram. knew Theodore would try to eyeball the feast and ruin the brioche. This place was 5 years of my life. 5 years of being told I was a ghost while they collected it. I don't want to share it with them, I said. Theodore stepped forward, his fists clenched at his side. This is our name on the sign, Nora. Father gave this to us. Father gave it to all of us, I said, looking him dead in the eye. But you took the coat, you took the credit. If I take this over Arthur, I want voting control, 51%. Vivian and Theodore can keep their equity shares as silent partners, but they don't have keys to the buildings. They don't hire the staff, and they don't step behind the line. Vivian looked like she had been slept. You're banning us from our own restaurants? You banned me 3 hours ago, I said. You told me I was a liability because the line cooks respected me more than you. You were right about one thing, though. The hierarchy was confused. Let's clear it up. Arthur looked from me to Vivian, a small grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. I'll have my lawyers draft the corporate restructuring by tonight, he said. Theodore, give her your keys now. Theodore didn't move. He stood there, his jaw working, his eyes darting toward the back door where Marcus and the other cooks were still watching through the screen. The keys, Theodore, Arthur repeated, his voice harder this time. Or I call the bank before 5 o'clock. With a jerk of his hand, Theodore reached into his pocket and slammed a heavy brass rings of keys onto the stainless steel prep table. The metal clattered loudly against the steel, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged kitchen. He didn't look at me as he turned and walked out the back door, his heavy clogs thudding against the concrete. Vivian stayed for a moment longer. She looked at the keys, then at me. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line that showed the deep brackets around her mouth. You think you can do this alone, she asked, her voice dropping to a hiss. You think the distributors will take you seriously when they realize you can't even try the product. You're a freak, Nora. They're going to eat you alive. The distributors already take me seriously, Vivian, I said, because I'm the one who notices when they short us 3 pounds on the halibut billing. Goodbye. She turned on her heel and followed Theodore out into the alley, leaving the door to swing shut behind her. The kitchen was quiet then, save for the low hum of the remaining refrigeration units. Arthur Sterling looked at his watch, then up at the order monitor above the pass. 4:45, he said. The dining room opens in 45 minutes. Do we have a service tonight, chef? I reached out and picked up the brass key ring from the table. The metal felt cold and heavy in my palm. I looked over at the screen door where Marcus was already standing, waiting for the word. Bring them back in, Marcus, I said. We have 45 minutes to prep the line from scratch, and someone needs to throw that burnt balsamic in the trash. The next 3 hours were a blur of heat, noise, and numbers. I didn't have time to think about Vivian's face or Theodore's empty station. I stood at the pass, the central command post of the kitchen, where every plate came from the line before it went to the dining room. I couldn't taste the sauce, but I knew the exact visual markers of a perfect emulsion. I knew that if the red wine reduction had the right viscosity, it would cling to the back of a spoon with a specific glossy weight. I could see the steam rising from the halibut. If it was too thick, the fish was overcooking. If it was a thin, wispy vapor, the core temperature was exactly 130 degrees. Marcus worked the grill like a man possessed. Every time he finished a steak, he held it up for me to see the sear. Perfect crosshatch, Nora, he'd grunt. Keep it down by 2 degrees on the resting board. I called back. The plates are running hot tonight because the dishwasher has the rinse cycles set too high. By 9 p.m., the ticket machine finally slowed its frantic clicking to a sporadic thump. The dining room was emptying out, the theater crowd already gone. I leaned against the pass, my apron stained with charcoal and oil, my legs trembling slightly from the hours of standing. My skin under the long sleeves of my shirt, the thick, pale scar tissue from the fire, prickled with heat of the ovens. But for the first time in 10 years, it didn't feel like a weight. It just felt like skin. Arthur Sterling walked into the kitchen from the front of the house, holding a small leather notebook. The food critic from the Chronicle just left, he said, stepping over a wet floor sign near the dish pit. He had the duck, not Theodore's version, the one you corrected before the rush. And? I asked, wiping my hands on a dry towel. He asked to see the chef, Arthur said, looking down at his notebook. I told him the executive chef was currently restructuring the corporate entity and wasn't available for interviews. He said it was the best execution of a classic French reduction he'd had in the city since 2022. Arthur closed the notebook with a sharp snap. The lawyers will have the signature pages ready by 10 tomorrow morning at my office. Don't be late, Nora. We have 4 more kitchens to audit before Monday. I nodded. I'll be there at 9. When Arthur left, the kitchen staff began the slow, rhythmic process of breaking down the stations. The scrape of metal spatulas against the grill, the splash of soapy water over the stainless steel, the low murmur of tired people who knew they'd done good work. I walked out the back door into the cool night air. Edmund was still there, sitting on the hood of his sedan, a paper cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as the screen door banged shut behind me. How does it feel? He asked, offering me the cup. It feels like work, I said, sitting down next to him on the warm metal of the hood. The coffee smelled strong, bitter, and dark, though my tongue could only register the heat of the liquid. My head was spinning with numbers. The fish inventory for tomorrow, the payroll taxes for Tuesday, the cost of a new compressor for the guard manger station. As I reached for the coffee, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Ashford, the youngest brother, who hadn't shown up to the flagship during the disaster. Nora, Vivian told me what happened. You can't let Arthur do this. The Midtown lease is under my name personally. If the group defaults, I'm ruined. Let's talk tomorrow before you go to his office. Just us 3. We're family. I looked at the screen for a long time, the green light reflecting off the dark glass. A month ago, I would have replied within seconds, frantic to fix whatever problem they had dropped at my feet. I would have offered to take the midnight shift at Midtown to balance their books so Ashford wouldn't have to worry. I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket without typing a word. What is it? Edmund asked, watching my face. Just some noise from the Midtown station, I said, looking out at the dark alley. It can wait until Monday, but it couldn't wait until Monday. That was the lie I told myself so I could get 6 hours of sleep. At 4:30 a.m. on Saturday, my phone vibrated against the nightstand, a long, angry buzz that meant a system-level alert. It wasn't Ashford this time. It was the automated payroll software. I sat up in the dark, the harsh white light of the screen illuminating the bedroom. Edmund shifted beside me, pulling the duvet over his shoulder with a quiet tone. I opened the email. The notification was a standard bounce back. Insufficient funds for the scheduled Tuesday payroll job. Error code 402. My chest tightened. I slid out of bed, grabbing my laptop from the desk, and padded out to the living room. The hardwood was cold against my bare feet. I logged into the master banking portal using the backdoor admin credentials Theodore didn't know I had. The depth of the incompetence was breathtaking. Theodore hadn't just drained the operational account for the buyout attempt. He had been moving money in a frantic shell game for months. He was pulling cash from the flagship's weekend reserves to pay the Midtown rent, then using the third location's catering deposits to cover the flagship's produced vendors. The Q3 expansion they had pitched to Arthur, it wasn't an expansion. It was a cover story to secure a capital injection to pay off a massive balloon loan Vivienne had taken out to remodel the private dining room. The group wasn't just stalling, it was actively suffocating. By Tuesday, 210 employees were going to check their bank accounts and find nothing. At 7:30 a.m., I was sitting in the polished marble lobby of Arthur Sterling's investment firm, a cardboard cup of bodega tea warming my hands. When Arthur walked through the glass doors at 8, he didn't look surprised to see me an hour early. He just nodded toward the elevator. His office was on the 40th floor, a sterile expanse of glass and chrome that smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. The junior associate was already there, laying out thick stacks of paper bound with blue legal clips. "You saw the payroll alert," Arthur said, taking off his overcoat. It wasn't a question. "We are short $42,000 for Tuesday," I said, sitting in one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "And that doesn't cover the overdue invoice for the meat purveyor. If we don't pay them by Monday morning, they cut off the Wagyu supply to the steakhouse on 8. Arthur sat down and folded his hands over the desk. "I ordered a full forensic audit at midnight. My accountants found the balloon loan Vivienne took out. They also found a series of consulting fees paid out to an LLC registered to Theodore's wife." I closed my eyes. The exhaustion from last night's service was still sitting heavy in my bones, and now my skull was beginning to throb. "He's been siphoning. Not enough to go to prison," Arthur said dryly, "but enough to bleed the margins dry. They were arrogant, Laura. They thought the brand name your father built would carry them through any financial mismanagement. They thought fine dining was about taking photos in the dining room, not managing food costs." He pushed a heavy brass pen across the desk, then slid the first stack of papers toward me. "This is the restructuring agreement. 51% of the equity transfers to you. The remaining 49% is split between Vivienne, Theodore, and Ashford, but stripped of all operational authority. You are the CEO and executive chef. I am releasing a bridge loan of $100,000 into the main operating account at 9 a.m. to cover payroll and the meat vendor." I picked up the pen. The metal was cold. "What's the catch, Arthur?" "The bridge loan is personally guaranteed by you," he said. His pale eyes didn't blink. "I believe in your talent, Laura. I saw you run that kitchen last night. You have the mind for this. But I don't throw good money after bad. If you can't stabilize the cash flow in 60 days, I liquidate the entire group to recoup my investment. You lose the restaurants. All of them. 60 days to untangle 5 years of my siblings' financial fraud. 60 days to fix 5 different kitchens, reestablish vendor trust, and stop the bleeding." I didn't hesitate. I signed my name on the blue line, the ink flowing smooth and dark against the heavy paper. I flipped the page and signed the next one. 13 signatures later, I pushed the stack back across the desk. "I need the locks changed at all 5 locations by noon," I said, "and I want their corporate credit cards canceled immediately." "Already done," Arthur said, tapping his pen. "Good luck, chef." I left the building and flagged a taxi. I needed to get to the Midtown location before the weekend brunch service started. Brunch was a notoriously chaotic shift. High volume, low margins, endless modifications. It was also the shift Ashford was supposed to be managing. Midtown was a sprawling, multi-level space with exposed brick and hanging Edison bulbs, designed to look effortless but costing a fortune in upkeep. I walked through the front doors at 9:15 a.m. The host stand was empty. The dining room was loud with the clatter of silverware and the low hum of 100 conversations, but the energy was frantic. I bypassed the dining room and pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. It was a war zone. The ticket printer was spitting out a continuous curling ribbon of paper that rolled on the floor. Smoke was billowing from the flat top, where a pile of hash browns was rapidly turning to carbon. The expediter, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, was staring at the board with a frozen panic. And sitting in the small glass-walled manager's office in the corner was Ashford. He had his head in his hands, his pristine chef coat unbuttoned, staring at his phone. I walked onto the line. I didn't yell. I didn't slam anything down. I just stepped up to the flat top, grabbed a metal bench scraper, and shoved the burning potatoes into the grease trap. "Scrape it," I told the line cook next to me. "Re-oil. Drop 4 fresh orders, medium heat." He startled, but he immediately moved to obey. I walked over to the expediter, ripped the 3-foot ribbon of tickets from the machine, and spread them across the metal counter. I scanned the timestamp. They were 20 minutes behind. "Fire table 12, table 14, and the 4 top at the window," I called out, my voice cutting through the clatter. "I need 6 eggs poached soft, 2 well-done omelet, and a stack of buttermilk pancakes." 3 minutes, the kitchen shifted. It was like watching a machine click back into gear. They just needed someone to call the cadence. For the next 40 minutes, I stood at the pass, reading tickets, calling orders, and plating food. I checked the hollandaise by observing its viscosity as it pooled over the English muffins. I tapped the center of the steaks with my tongs to gauge the doneness. I didn't need to taste the salt. I could see how it crystallized on the surface of the meat. When the board was finally clear and the rush had slowed to a manageable hum, I wiped my hands on a towel and walked toward the glass office. I pushed the door open. Ashford looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled like stale gin and expensive hair product. "Nora," he croaked, "you're here." "The board is clear," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Why were you hiding in the office during the Saturday pop?" Ashford swallowed hard. He looked at the laptop screen on the desk. "Vivienne called me this morning. She said you and Arthur stole the company. She said you forced them out and that the banks were going to freeze everything." "The banks aren't freezing anything," I said, "because I just took on $100,000 in personal debt to cover the payroll you 3 couldn't be bothered to manage." Ashford flinched. "I didn't know about the money, Nora, I swear. Theodore handled all the accounts. I just did the scheduling. You let the kitchen drown while you were feeling sorry for yourself," I said softly. "I can't do this without them," Ashford said, his voice cracking. He looked incredibly young in that moment, just a scared kid wearing a coat he hadn't earned. "I don't know how to run a service. I only got through culinary school because Vivienne did my practical exams." I stared at him. him. I had always suspected it, but hearing it out loud was a different kind of bitter. Give me your keys, Ashford. He didn't fight me. He reached into his pocket and handed them over. Are you firing me? You're an owner, I said. I can't fire you. But you are permanently relieved of all operational duties. Go home. Don't come back to any of the properties unless I explicitly invite you. He stood up, looking relieved and devastated all at once. As he walked past me out of the office, I sat down at his desk and opened the master inventory spreadsheet. I had to start placing orders for Monday, and I needed to figure out exactly how much damage control I had to do with the suppliers. I spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing invoices. It was worse than I thought. 6 vendors had placed us on a cash-on-delivery hold. The produce supplier had threatened to send us to collections. At 2:08 p.m., my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized. Martin, the regional manager for our primary dry goods supplier. I answered on the second ring. Martin, it's Nora. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Nora. I was expecting Vivian. Vivian is no longer managing operations for the group, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. I am stepping in as executive chef and CEO. I saw we have a past due balance of $14,000. I'm authorizing a wire transfer for the full amount on Monday morning. I need our regular delivery released for Tuesday. Martin cleared his throat. It was a thick, uncomfortable sound. Listen, Nora. Vivian called me about an hour ago. She told me about the restructuring. My stomach gave a slow, unpleasant roll. What exactly did she tell you? She said there was a hostile takeover. She also said, he hesitated. She said you were medically unfit to run the kitchens, that your palate was gone from the accident, and the board was trying to hide it to protect the Michelin stars. The air in the small glass office felt suddenly very thin. Vivian wasn't just angry. She was actively trying to burn the house down on her way out. If the suppliers thought the food quality was going to tank, they would drop our credit lines entirely. They wouldn't want their premium products associated with a failing brand. Martin, I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, dangerous register. Did I ever write a menu that failed to sell? No, he admitted. Who designed the spring tasting menu that got a write-up in the Times last year? You did, Nora. But writing a menu on a laptop is different from running 5-line kitchens. Vivian made it sound like you can't even tell if the flour is rancid. If I wire you $20,000 on Monday instead of 14, will you put the Tuesday truck on the road? Another pause. Cash clears all doubts, Nora. But I'm going to need to see the new corporate paperwork, and my boss is going to want a meeting. Send him to the flagship on Wednesday at noon, I said. I'll cook for him myself. I hung up the phone and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes. Vivian was calling the vendors. She was poisoning the well. If she got to the investors who held the minority stakes in the smaller business, she could trigger a panic sell-off that would crush our valuation. I picked up my phone to call Arthur, but a text message timed before I could dial. It was from an unknown number. Check your email. We aren't going quietly. I opened my inbox. There was a message from Theodore. No text in the body. A PDF of a legal filing. I opened it. It was a petition for a temporary restraining order and an injunction filed in the state civil court. Theodore and Vivian were claiming that Arthur's exercise of the emergency receivership laws was fraudulent, and they were seeking to freeze all corporate assets until a judge could review the case. If a judge granted the freeze, I wouldn't be able to access the operating account. I wouldn't be able to pay the bridge loan out to the staff on Tuesday. The payroll would bounce anyway. The kitchen outside the glass office was prepping for dinner service. The rhythmic chopping of knives against cutting boards providing a steady, mocking heartbeat to the silence in the room. I looked out at the line cooks, pulling on their clean aprons, trusting that the system would hold, trusting that their checks would clear. I needed a lawyer, and I needed to find a way to stop my sister before Monday morning, or the empire I had just won would be dead before I ever got to wear the crown. I forwarded the PDF to Arthur's email with a single word in the subject line. Injunction. 10 seconds later, my phone rang. They filed it in civil court, Arthur said. There was no greeting. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, which meant he was already in the back of his town car, moving on to the next crisis. My legal team pulled the docket number. It's real. Can a judge grant it over the weekend? I asked, staring through the glass wall of the office of the expediter, who was now calmly wiping down his station. Usually no, but Vivian's lawyer attached a claim of imminent financial ruin and cited your lack of operational experience. It's a stalling tactic, Nora. They know they can't win a prolonged case, but they don't have to. If the judge issues a temporary freeze on Monday morning, the operational accounts lock down. My bridge loan will bounce back to my firm. The payroll fails. Can your lawyers block it? We can file a counter motion, Arthur said, but it will take 48 hours to get a hearing. By then, the damage is done. Your vendors walk, your staff walks. The brand becomes toxic. I won't fund a toxic brand, Nora. You have until Sunday night to make them withdraw that petition. How am I supposed to do that? You have leverage, Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Use it. Theodore's wife's LLC, the balloon loan. You think these people want a public trial where forensic accountants detail how they defrauded their own company to pay for country club memberships? Put a gun to their heads. Metaphorically speaking. Call me a scandal. The line went dead. I sat the phone down on the desk. The numbers on the master inventory spreadsheet blurred slightly. I closed the laptop, packed it into my bag, and walked out of the glass office. The kitchen was in the middle of a shift change. The morning crew was breaking down their stations, and the dinner crew was tying on their aprons. I found the Midtown sous chef, a quiet guy named David who had been doing the job of an executive chef on half a day. David, I said. Ashford went home. He won't be back. You're running the past tonight. David wiped his hands on a side towel. He didn't look surprised, just tired. Okay, chef, what about the menu? Ashford wanted to run the lamb special, but the meat didn't come in. 86 for lamb. Run the duck breast with the cherry reduction from the flagship. I'll email you the exact spec sheet and plating guide in 10 minutes. Can you hand it a Friday night volume without me? David gave a short, dry laugh. We've been handling the volume without him for 2 years. We'll be fine. I nodded, gave him a brief pat on the shoulder, and walked out the back door into the afternoon. Edmund was waiting in his car a block away. I slid into the passenger seat and let my head fall back against the headrest. The smell of yeast and vanilla still clung to his clothes from the bakery, a comforting, grounding scent that belonged to a world completely separate from the one I was currently drowning in. Westchester, I said, my eyes closed. Theodore. Edmund put the car in drive without a word. He didn't ask questions. He knew my siblings better than anyone outside the family. Knew the exact brand of venom they were capable of. We hit the highway, and I spent the 40-minute drive drafting the exact phrasing I was going to use to dismantle my brother's life. Theodore lived in a sprawling, colonial-style house in a gated subdivision that reeked of generational wealth he hadn't actually earned. His wife, Clara, was a former interior designer who treated the house like a showroom. There were always fresh hydrangeas on the porch and 3 leased luxury SUVs in the driveway. Today, only Vivian's black Mercedes and Theodore's Range Rover were parked out front. Do you want me to come in? Edmund asked as he cut the engine. No. If you're there, Theodore will posture. He has to perform for an audience. I need him backed into a corner where there's no one to perform for. I walked up the bluestone path and didn't bother knocking. I used the keypad code Theodore had given me 3 years ago when I had to come over at 2 in the morning to fix a plumbing emergency while they were on vacation in Aspen. The code was still the same. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The house was dead quiet, the air conditioning running from so high it raised goosebumps on my arm. I walked past the formal living room and headed straight for the kitchen. They were sitting at the massive marble island. Theodore, Vivian, and Clara. There was a half-empty bottle of Sancerre on the counter, and Vivian was scrolling rapidly on an iPad. Clara looked pale and rigid, her hands wrapped tightly around a wine glass. Theodore looked at me as I walked in. His face instantly flushed a dark, violent red. How the hell did you get in here? He demanded, standing up so fast his bar stool scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Get out of my house, Laura. We have a restraining order. You filed a petition for a temporary injunction, I corrected, dropping my bag onto the marble island. It made a heavy, satisfying thud. It hasn't been signed by a judge, which means it isn't worth the paper your lawyer printed it on. Vivian set the iPad down carefully. She looked immaculate, not a hair out of place, but the tight skin around her eyes betrayed her. It will be signed on Monday morning. Your little coup with Arthur is over. We're freezing the accounts, dissolving the receivership, and returning the board to its legal structure. You mean you're going to try to stall Arthur until Tuesday so the payroll bounces? I said. And then you're going to blame the insolvency on me and tell the minority investors I drove the company into the ground. Vivian offered a thin, cold smile. It's the truth. You don't have the temperament to lead. We're just protecting Father's legacy. Father's legacy, I repeated. I looked at Clara. She was staring at me, her eyes darting between me and her husband. Does Clara know about Father's legacy, or just her part in it? Theodore stepped around the island, his fists clenched. Shut up, Nora. This doesn't involve her. Leave my wife out of this. She's already in it, I said, my voice completely flat. Arthur ordered a forensic audit at midnight last night. His accountants didn't just find the balloon loan Vivian took out to remodel the private dining rooms. They found the consulting fees. Clara blinked, her grip on the wine glass tightening. What consulting fees? The $55,000 paid out over the last 8 months to an LLC registered in your name, Clara, I said, not taking my eyes off Theodore. Billed to the flagship's operational account for design and aesthetic consulting. Funny, because the only thing you've designed this year is the nurseries upstairs. Clara's face went completely bloodless. She turned to Theodore. Ted, what is she talking about? It's a tax strategy, Theodore stammered, stepping back toward her. It's completely legal, Clara. Our accountant cleared it. She's just trying to scare you. A tax strategy is writing off a business dinner, I said. Billing a failing restaurant for phantom services to pay your personal mortgage is corporate fraud, especially when it drains the exact account meant for vendor payments and payroll. I leaned against the marble island, crossing my arms. If that injunction goes before a judge on Monday, Arthur's lawyers are going to submit the forensic audit as Exhibit A to prove gross mismanagement. The audit goes into the public court record, which means the IRS gets a copy, the state tax board gets a copy, and the bank that holds the mortgage on this house gets a copy. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the massive Sub-Zero refrigerator behind Theodore. Withdraw the petition, I said softly. Call your lawyer right now and tell him to pull it. You walk away with your minority shares intact. You sign the non-competes. You never set foot in the kitchens again, but you stay out of prison. Theodore looked like he was going to throw up. He looked at Vivian, waiting for her to fix it, waiting for his older sister to wave a hand and make the problem disappear like she had 1,000 times before. But Vivian didn't look panicked. She looked at me with a strange, dark calculation. She picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down. You think you're very smart, Nora, Vivian said, her voice smooth as glass. You think you can just wave Arthur Sterling's money around and frighten us into submission. But you're forgetting something. Arthur doesn't own the whole company. He owns 30%. We own the rest. I have 51% voting control as of this morning, I reminded her. Only if the restructuring holds, Vivian countered. And there's a clause in the original operating agreement Father drafted, a failsafe. If a majority of the minority shareholders file a formal declaration of no confidence in the acting CEO, the board must freeze all executive action until a full shareholder vote can be held. My stomach tightened. The silent partners. Vivian smiled. It was a genuine smile this time, sharp and lethal. Elias Thorne, the Millers, David Chen. They collectively hold 12% of the company. And I've been on the phone with them all morning. I told them Arthur was trying a hostile takeover, using a mentally unstable former employee as a puppet. I told them you had a breakdown in the kitchen last night and threw the staff out into the alley. That's a lie, I said, my voice hardening. It doesn't matter if it's a lie, Vivian said softly. It matters what Elias Thorne believes. He was Father's oldest friend. He's old, he's conservative, and he hates Arthur Sterling's corporate tactics. Elias is hosting a brunch at his estate in Connecticut tomorrow at noon. Theodore and I are driving up there to collect his signature on the Declaration of No Confidence. Once Elias signs it, the Millers and Chen will follow. Vivian stood up, smoothing the front of her designer blouse. You can show Arthur's audit to the judge on Monday all you want. By then, Elias will have frozen your CEO status, and the receivership will be locked in litigation for 3 years. The brand will die, but Theodore and I will liquidate the real estate and walk away clean. She walked past me, stopping just short of the doorway. You're a good prep cook, Nora, she whispered, but you don't know how to play the game. You never did. She walked out of the kitchen. A moment later, the front door clicked shut. I looked back at Theodore. He was avoiding my eyes, his his hand resting on Clara's shoulder as she cried silently into her hands. They looked pathetic, a couple of drowning people dragging each other down. I didn't feel sorry for them. I felt absolutely nothing. I picked up my bag. If she fails tomorrow, Theodore, I am handing the audit to the authorities myself. I walked out of the house and got back into Edmund's car. Well, he asked, studying my face. Vivienne is going to Elias Thorne tomorrow to get a vote of no confidence signed, I said, pulling out my phone. I stared at the blank screen, my mind racing through the variables, the timelines, the logistics. She's going to use the silent partners to block the restructuring before Arthur's bridge loan can clear the payroll. Edmund frowned. Elias Thorne. The old guy with the cane who always orders the Dover sole when it comes to the flagship. Yes. I unlocked my phone and opened my contacts. He's old money. He doesn't care about forensic audits or corporate debt. He cares about loyalty, and he cares about the food. Vivienne is banking on the fact that he's known her since she was a child. She thinks he'll take her word over Arthur's. So what do? We don't let her control the narrative, I said. I found the number I was looking for. It was a long shot. A massive, terrifying long shot, but I didn't have any other cards to play. I hit dial and put the phone to my ear. It rang 4 times before a gravelly, slow voice answered. Hello, Thorne, I said, keeping my voice steady, respectful but firm. This is Nora Vance. There was a pause. Nora, little Nora. Vivienne told me you were indisposed. I was terribly sorry to hear about your difficulties. Vivienne is mistaken, Mr. Thorne. I am not indisposed. I am the new acting CEO of the hospitality group, backed by Arthur Sterling's emergency receivership. Another long pause. I could hear a clock ticking heavily in the background on his end of the line. Vivienne painted a very different picture this morning. She claims Arthur is attempting a theft of your father's legacy and using you to do it. With all due respect, Mr. Thorne, Vivienne hasn't cooked a dish in one of our restaurants in 4 years, I said. She doesn't know father's legacy anymore, but I do. I know she and Theodore are coming to your estate tomorrow at noon to ask for your signature. I would like to be there. It's a private brunch, Nora, Elias said gently, the way one speaks to a confused child. My chef is preparing a small meal. We are just going to review some paperwork. Tell your chef to take the morning off, I said, gripping the phone tighter. Let me cook the brunch. Let me prove to you that the quality, the standard, the soul of this company is exactly where it has always been. In the kitchen. With me. Elias was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. You want to cook for me, he finally said, a hint of amusement breaking through the old dry voice. Nora, my dear, Vivienne mentioned that since the accident, well, she mentioned you cannot taste. A working palate does not make a chef, Mr. Thorne. Pure passion does. Let me prove it. Elias sighed. A long, rattling sound. My chef was planning to serve a traditional French menu. Sole meuniere. Can you execute it without tasting the brown butter? I can execute it blindfolded, I said. Noon, Nora. Bring your own knives. If the food is adequate, I will listen to your side of the story before I sign anything. If it fails, I will sign Vivienne's declaration before the plates are cleared. Understood. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. I hung up. My hands were shaking, just a little. Edmund was staring at me. You're going to cook a private brunch for the man who holds the fate of the company, while your sister sits at the table trying to destroy you? Yes, I said. And you have to make sole meuniere, a dish that relies entirely on the exact split-second balance of acidity in the lemon juice and the nutty flavor of the browned butter. Yes. Edmund put the car in gear and pulled away from Theodore's immaculate lawn. Then we need to go back to the flagship right now. We need the best cuts of fish in the walk-in, and we need to steal a block of that imported Normandy butter Theodore was hoarding in the back freezer. I looked out the window at the passing trees. The exhaustion that had been dragging at my bones for 24 hours was suddenly gone, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. No, I said. We don't go to the flagship. Vivienne will have someone watching the inventory logs. If I pull premium product tonight, she'll know I'm coming. She'll find a way to sabotage it or lock me out of the system entirely. Then where do we get Dover sole at 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday? I looked at Edmund. We don't. We drive to the coast. We find a day boat that just came in, and we buy it straight off the dock. It took us nearly 3 hours to reach the eastern docks. The sun was already gone, replaced by the harsh sodium orange glare of the harbor lights. The air out here was heavy, smelling of diesel fuel, wet rope, and low tide. By the time Edmund parked the car near the terminus, the main auction house was shuttered, and most of the concrete loading bays were washed clean. The big boats, the ones that contracted with the city distributors, had unloaded at 2 in the afternoon. But I didn't want a fish that had been sitting on a truck for 6 hours. I wanted the stragglers, the independent operators who went out on single-engine skiffs and stayed until they hit their personal quota. We walked down the wooden pier, our shoes actually quiet. At the far end, a man in yellow rubber overalls was aggressively hosing down the deck of a weathered 20-foot center console. I stopped at the edge of the slip. Did you pull any flatfish today? The man didn't look up. He just kept moving the heavy spray of the hose over the fiberglass. Everything sold. Contracted to a buyer. Pickup is at 5 a.m. I need 2 whole Dover sole, I said. I'll pay double whatever the guy in Brooklyn is giving you. That made him turn off the hose. He looked up at me, taking in my plain clothes, then looking at Edmund standing quietly behind me. I don't break contracts for walk-ups, and I don't have Dover. We pull winter flounder and fluke in these waters. If you want European Dover, go to a specialty market. I know what's in these waters, I said, my voice staying perfectly level. And I know a large winter flounder, caught today and handled right, will cook beautifully. Show me what's in the hole. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he sighed, wiped his hands on his overalls, and walked over to a massive white Yeti cooler strapped to the deck. He threw open the lid. It was packed with crushed ice. He reached in and pulled out a flat diamond-shaped fish, about 2 pounds, dropping it unceremoniously onto the metal cutting board bolted to the gun. $20 a pound, he said, testing me. That was extortion. That was 4 times the market rate. I stepped onto the boat without asking permission. The deck shifted slightly under my weight. I didn't negotiate. I just looked at the fish. The eyes were convex and crystal clear, not sunken or cloudy. I pressed my thumb into the thickest part of the fillet near the spine. The flesh sprang back instantly, leaving no indentation. Rigor mortis was still holding the muscle fibers tight. I lifted the gill flap. The filaments inside were the color of a crushed red brick, bright and wet. It's perfect, I said. I pulled my wallet out of my back pocket, took out $200 bills, and slapped them flat on the wet cutting board. I'll take this one, and the one right underneath it in the cooler. Don't gut them. I want them whole on the bone. The fisherman looked at the money, then at me. He didn't say another word. He bagged the fish in heavy mill plastic, packed it with fresh ice from the cooler, and handed it over. We drove back to the city in silence. It was past midnight when we got to Edmund's apartment. We still didn't have the butter. Sole meuniere is practically 50% butter by volume. It requires a high butter fat content, ideally cultured, something something that will brown evenly without separating into a greasy puddle of milk solids. Edmund didn't ask questions. He just made a phone call to his bakery's night manager. At 1 in the morning, we were standing in the back of his darkened cafe, cutting a 2-pound block of imported cultured pork straight from the walk-in. We got 3 hours of sleep. I woke up at 5:30 on Sunday morning, my chest tight, the phantom heat of the kitchen already coming in my blood. I showered in the dark. I put on black slacks, comfortable non-slip shoes, and a clean starched white chef coat I hadn't worn in 3 years. No logos, no embroidery, just plain heavy cotton. Edmund drove. The drive to Connecticut took 2 hours. Elias Thorne's estate was located at the end of a long, winding road flanked by ancient oak trees. The kind of property that doesn't have a number of windows, just a heavy wrought iron gate that requires a security clearance. I gave my name to the voice of the call box. A minute later, the gate swung open to a slow mechanical hum. The house was a massive stone colonial overlooking a manicured lawn that sloped down to a private lake. As we pulled into a circular driveway, I saw a silver Porsche already parked near the front steps. I checked the time. It was 8:30. Vivian and Theodore weren't due until noon. Ready? Edmund asked, cutting the engine. No, I said. I grabbed my canvas knife roll from the back seat, tucked the insulated cooler bag with the fish and butter under my arm, and got out of the car. A housekeeper answered the door, her face a mask of polite confusion. Before she could ask who I was, a man in his late 20s walked into the foyer. He was wearing a fitted chef coat with the estate's little crest embroidered on the breast. This was Julian, Elias's private chef. He looked at my coat, then at my knife roll. Nora Vance, he asked, his tone clipping the edges of professional courtesy. Mr. Thorne told me you were coming. I cleared the center prep island for you. But I have to say, this is highly irregular. I had a menu prep. I know, Julian, I apologize for the disruption, I said, stepping past him into the house. I won't be in your way. I just need the stove, a fish spatula, and 1 large carbon steel skillet. He led me to a formal dining room that smelled of old wooden furniture polish, and into the kitchen. It was absurdly beautiful. Custom look for new range, copper ventilation hood, dual walk-ins hidden behind paneled oak doors. It was a kitchen built for a television set, not a working line, but the equipment was top tier. I set my cooler on the island and unrolled my canvas bag. The familiar clatter of my knives against the stone counter grounded me. The panic that had been buzzing behind my ribs since Vivian's threat yesterday began to recede, replaced by the cold, calculating geometry of cooking. I pulled the flounder from the ice. It had rested perfectly. Julian hovered near the sink, arms crossed. You're doing full Munier for Mr. Thorne? Yes. I hope you know his talent. A slight edge of defensiveness in his voice. He doesn't tolerate heavy salt, and if the butter is even a fraction past noisette, he'll send it back. He says it tastes like burnt metal. I know exactly how he likes it, I said. I didn't look at him. I took my bony knife and began cleaning the fish. I moved with total muscle memory. Scaling, snipping the fins, removing the dark skin while leaving the white skin intact to protect the delicate flesh during the sear. I worked in complete silence for 2 hours, prepping the fish, picking the perfect leaves of flatly parsley, and juicing the lemon. I strained the lemon juice twice to ensure not a single microscopic piece of pulp would interrupt the texture of the sauce. At 11:40, the quiet of the house was broken by the sound of tires on a gravel driveway. A few moments later, I heard the heavy front door open, followed by the unmistakable, carrying pitch of Vivian's voice. And frankly, Elias, it's a tragedy, but we have to protect the staff. She was erratic, throwing things. It breaks my heart, but Theodore and I had no choice. They were walking through the hallway toward the sunroom, which was adjacent to the kitchen. I didn't stop what I was doing. I took the block of cultured butter and began cutting it into exact half-ounce cubes, lining them up on a cold metal tray. Elias Thorne's voice murmured something in response, too low to catch, but the tone was grave. I have the declaration right here, Theodore said, his voice trying hard to project masculine authority, and mostly just sounding loud. If you just sign the bottom, we can get it to the corporate lawyers by tomorrow morning and freeze Arthur Sterling out before he does any more damage. I will review it, Elias said, his voice clearer now as they entered the sunroom. But as I mentioned on the phone, Vivienne, there has been a slight change to the morning's itinerary. We are having brunch first, and I have invited a guest chef. There was a pause. A thick, heavy silence settled over the adjacent room. I struck the burner on the La Cornue range. The blue flame hissed to life. I set the heavy carbon steel pan over the fire and let it heat. A guest chef? Vivienne asked, her voice tight. Elias, I thought Julian was kind enough to seat his kitchen for the morning, Elias replied. Shall we take a seat? I believe the first course is nearly ready. I didn't wait for them to come in. I dredged the flounder in a whisper-thin coating of Wandra flour, shaking off every speck of excess until it was just a ghostly dusting. I dropped 2 cubes of butter into the hot pan. The sound was immediate and aggressive, a sharp sizzling crackle as the water in the butter boiled off. When the foaming subsided, I gently laid the fish into the pan, white skin down. It hissed loudly. I pressed down on the thickest part of the fillet with a flexible spatula to ensure even contact. I couldn't taste, but I didn't need to. I watched the edges of the fish where it met the pan. I was looking for a specific shade of golden brown to creep up the side of the flesh. I was listening for the sound of the sizzle to drop in pitch, indicating that the moisture was leaving the skin and the crisping process had begun. Footsteps approached the open archway between the sunroom and the kitchen. What is she doing here? Theodore hissed. I didn't turn around. I basted the top of the fish with the hot butter, the spoon moving in quick rhythmic arcs. Good morning, Theodore, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the hiss of the pan. Vivienne, grab a plate. Service is in 3 minutes. Elias, this is exactly what I was talking about, Vivienne said, her voice rising in genuine panic now. She stepped into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply on the tile. She forced her way in here. She's unstable. You can't eat that. She has no idea what she's doing. She did not force her way in, Vivienne, Elias said. He appeared in the archway, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped cane. He was 75, dressed in a soft wool sweater and tailored trousers. His eyes, pale blue and razor-sharp, were fixed entirely on my hands. I invited her. I told her if she could cook a proper sole Munier, I would listen to her side of this corporate restructuring. She can't even taste it, Vivienne cried, dropping the facade of the concerned sister entirely. She hasn't tasted food in 12 years. She's making a fool of you, Elias. Vivienne, Elias said quietly. Be silent. The command was absolute. Vivienne snapped her mouth shut, her face flushing an ugly mottled red. I flipped the fish. It was perfect. An unbroken golden crust across the entire surface. I let it cook for exactly 60 seconds on the second side, then slid it out of the pan onto a warm serving platter. Now came the hardest part, the sauce. I wiped the pan completely completely clean with a towel, taking it off the heat for 5 seconds to drop the temperature. I put it back on the flame and dumped in the rest of the cubed butter. It immediately began to foam. I watched the bubbles. They started large and violent, then tightened into a dense, fine froth. The color of the liquid underneath shifted from pale yellow to gold. I leaned in, my face inches from the pan. I was looking for the exact second the milk solids separated and dropped to the bottom, turning the color of a toasted hazelnut. There. I pulled the pan off the heat entirely and squeezed the strained lemon juice directly into the screaming hot butter. The pan violently hissed and spat, the acid halting the cooking process instantly. I threw in a handful of chopped parsley, let it bloom for 2 seconds in the residual heat, and poured the foaming, aromatic sauce directly over the fish. The smell filled the kitchen. A deep, rich, nutty fragrance cut with the sharp and brightness of the lemon. It was a smell that commanded respect. I picked up the platter and walked my sister, bringing it into the sunroom. I set it gently on the center of the table in front of Elias. Julian, who had been watching in total silence from the corner, stepped forward with a stack of warm plates and silver serving gear. He expertly filleted the fish off the bone at the table, plating a pristine portion for Elias, leaving the rest on the platter. Theodore and Vivian stood frozen in the archway. They hadn't moved. Elias picked up his fork. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at my siblings. He cut a small piece of the fish, dragging it through the sauce, and placed it in his mouth. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched Elias's face. I watched the muscles in his jaw work as he chewed. I watched him swallow. He set his fork down on the edge of the plate with a soft clink. He took his napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth, and looked up at me. The texture is flawless, Elias said slowly. The crust is crisp. The flesh is completely opaque but yielding. The butter is brought to the absolute precipice of burning without crossing the line. The acidity perfectly balances the fat. He turned his head to look at Vivian. This is the best sole meuniere I have eaten since your father cooked it for me in Paris 30 years ago, Elias said. So, Vivian, you were telling me about your sister's lack of competence. Vivian looked like she had been struck with a blunt object. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked frantically at Theodore. Theodore was staring at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Elias, it's a trick, Vivian stammered. She practiced this one dish. It doesn't mean she can run a company. She's allied with Arthur Sterling. He's a corporate raider. He wants to strip the real estate and liquidate. Arthur Sterling wants a return on his investment, I said, stepping closer to the table. An investment that you and Theodore have been systematically draining to fund your personal lifestyles. I reached into my knife roll and pulled out a manila envelope. I had printed the first 5 pages of the forensic audit before we left Edmund's apartment. I dropped it on the table next to Elias's plate. That is a partial audit from midnight last night, I told Elias. It shows a $55,000 embezzlement disguised as consulting fees paid to Theodore's wife. It shows a balloon loan taken out against the Midtown property without board approval. The company is $42,000 short on payroll for Tuesday. They didn't come here to protect father's legacy, Mr. Thorne. They came here to get you to freeze my authority so they can cover up a crime. Elias stared at the envelope. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it for a long time, the silence stretching until it felt suffocating. Then he looked at Vivian. Is this true, Vivian? He asked. His voice was no longer the gentle tone of an old family friend. It was the voice of a man who had survived 50 years in high-stakes finance. It's taken out of context, Theodore burst out, stepping forward. Elias, the cash flow was tight because of the expansion. We had to move capital around to keep the vendors happy. I asked your sister, Elias snapped, cutting him off like a whip crack. Vivian stood tall, her spine rigid. She didn't look at Elias. She looked directly at me. The hatred in her eyes was so pure, so unadulterated it almost felt physical. We built the brand while she hid in the prep basement, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a harsh, ugly whisper. We did the press. We won the awards. We kept the lights on. We were entitled to compensation for carrying the weight of a cripple for a decade. Elias slowly picked up his napkin and placed it over his plate, covering the remaining fish. Get out of my house, Elias said. Vivian flinched. Elias repeated, his voice rising, echoing off the stone walls. Julian, show them to the door. If they do not leave immediately, call the local authorities and have them trespassed. Julian stepped forward immediately, his posture shifting from observer to enforcer. This way, please. Theodore grabbed Vivian's arm. He looked terrified. He pulled her toward the hallway, practically dragging her out of the kitchen. A minute later, the heavy front door slammed shut. The sound of the Porsche starting up and tearing down the gravel driveway drifted through the open windows. I stood by the island, my hands resting flat against the cool stone surface. The adrenaline was leaving my body in a sudden sickening rush, leaving my knees feeling like water. Elias picked up the manila envelope. He opened it, put on a pair of reading glasses, and scanned the first page. He sighed a deeply tired sound and tossed the papers back onto the table. Your father was a brilliant chef, Nora, Elias said softly, but he was a terrible judge of character. He always believed his children would rise to the occasion. He refused to see what Vivian and Theodore truly were. He took his reading glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I will not sign their declaration of no confidence, Elias said. Your restructuring with Arthur Sterling stands. The operational accounts will remain unlocked. You can pay your staff on Tuesday. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Do not thank me yet, Elias said, looking up. His pale blue eyes locked onto mine. Vivian was lying about your cooking, but she was not lying about Arthur Sterling. He is a shark, Nora. He doesn't care about your food, and he doesn't care about your family legacy. He cares about his margins. He gave me 60 days to turn the cash flow around, I said. Or he liquidates the company. Elias nodded slowly. 60 days to undo 5 years of financial rot. That is an impossible timeline. He knows that. He gave you that bridge loan because he expects you to fail. When you default in 60 days, he takes full ownership of the real estate, unencumbered by the family trust, and sells the buildings to developers. The cold returned, settling deep in my stomach. I won't fail. You are going to have to do more than cook perfect fish to survive, Arthur, Elias warned. He tapped his finger against the table. If you want to keep the group alive, you have to buy him out. And you can't use the operational revenue to do it because Theodore has let it dry. How much? I asked. Arthur holds 30% equity, plus the new $100,000 bridge loan you just personally guaranteed. Elias calculated quickly. You need $4 million in cash to force the buyout laws. Do you have $4 million, Nora? I stared at the empty carbon steel can sitting on the stove. No. Then you have a very difficult 2 months ahead of you, Elias said. He stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. The food was exceptional, Chef. Julian will show you out. I packed my knives in silence. Edmund helped me carry the cooler and the canvas bag back out to the car. The drive back to the city was different this time. The frantic and immediate panic of the injunction was gone, replaced by a massive crushing weight. I had won the battle. I had kept the keys, but I was standing in the middle of a burning building, and Arthur Sterling was the one holding the mattress. We got back to my apartment at 3 in the afternoon. I sat down on the edge of the bed and didn't move. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand. It was Martin, the regional manager for the dry goods supplier. I let it go to voicemail. Then Marcus, the grill lead from the flagship. Then David from Midtown. The entire empire was looking at me, waiting for directions. Edmund sat down next to me. He didn't try to touch my shoulder or offer platitudes. He just handed me a glass of water. Who's right about Arthur? Edmund said quietly. He's not a restaurateur. He's a liquidator. He set you up to take the fall for the bankruptcy so the family can't sue him when he sells the building. I know, I said. I took a sip of the water. It was ice cold. So what's the play? You can't generate $4 million in profit in 60 days. Even if all 5 restaurants are packed every night, the margins in fine dining are too thin. I know that too. I put the glass down on the nightstand. I looked at my phone. A new email had just popped up. It wasn't from a vendor or a line cook. It was from a generic unnamed address. I opened it. There was no text, just an attachment, a scanned copy of a signed contract. I zoomed in on the signatures at the bottom. One belonged to Theodore. The other belonged to a man named Vincent Rossi. I felt the blood drain from my face. Nora? Edmund asked, leaning closer to look at the screen. Who is Vincent Rossi? He's the largest independent meat distributor on the East Coast, I whispered. He practically owns the supply chain for prime beef in the tri-state area. We've never done business with him. Father explicitly banned it. Why? Because Rossi doesn't just sell meat. He loans money to struggling restaurants at predatory rates. If they can't pay, he takes over their liquor licenses and uses the properties to wash cash. I scrolled back up to the top of the contract. It was dated 4 months ago. It was a promissory note. Theodore hadn't just been moving money between the restaurants. When the Midtown lease had come due and the operational accounts were empty, he had borrowed $300,000 from Rossi, and he had used the flagship's liquor license as collateral. The terms were spelled out in bold hard print. The loan was due in full in 10 days. If it wasn't paid, Rossi had the legal right to seize the flagship's liquor license and assume control of the premises. Without the liquor license, a fine dining restaurant is dead and weak. He didn't just steal from us, I said, my voice barely audible. He sold us to a loan shark. I stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed and my own reflection stared back at me from the dark glass. My face was hollowed out. Who sent this? Edmund asked, his voice low. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine as he carefully pulled his own board into a close grip PDF. I don't know, I said. It's a generic Proton mail address, a string of numbers. Vivienne? No, I said, shaking my head. The exhaustion was a physical weight now, pressing down on the base of my skull. Vivienne wouldn't hand me the murder weapon. If Arthur sees this note, he pulls his bridge loan immediately. He's not going to wire $100,000 into an operational account if he knows a predatory lender is 10 days away from seizing the company's core asset. Vivienne wants me to fail, but she wants to do it through the minority shareholders so she can still salvage the real estate. If Rossi takes the license, the flagship's valuation drops to 0 overnight. She loses everything too. Edmund zoomed in on the top right corner of the scanned document. Look at this, he murmured. I leaned in. Just beneath Theodore's messy signature, there was a faint embossed ridge in the paper that had caught the light of the scanner. It was a letterhead, a very specific custom-pressed linen paper, a stylized C. Clara, I breathed. Theodore's wife, Edmund confirmed, handing the phone back to me. The one you just threatened with IRS exposure for the fake consulting fees. I stood up from the bed. My legs felt like lead, but the cold adrenaline was spreading through my chest again. Clara was panicking. She had gone digging through Theodore's home office the moment we left. She found the promissory note and realized her husband hadn't just committed tax fraud. He had leveraged the entire family empire to a shadow bank to cover his tracks. She's trying to buy immunity, I said. She's giving me the bomb so I can defuse it, hoping I won't turn over the audit to the authorities. Can you defuse it? Edmund asked. Rossi operates strictly through administrative chokeholds, I said, pacing the short length of the bedroom. He doesn't send guys with baseball bats. He sends high-priced lawyers to the State Beverage Control Board. The second that 10-day window closes, his attorneys will file a lien against the flagship's liquor license. In this city, you can't transfer a license to an active lien, and you can't serve alcohol. The state sends an inspector to physically confiscate the certificate from the wall. We lose the wine pairings, the cocktail program, 50% of our profit margin instantly. The dining room empties out. Then he offers to buy the distressed property for pennies on the dollar to forgive the debt. $300,000, Edmund said, rubbing his temples. Nora, even if you run a perfect every night across all 5 locations, you don't clear that kind of cash in a week, not net. I know. If you tell Arthur he pulls his bridge loan, the payroll bounces on Tuesday. You lose. And if I don't tell Arthur, I said, stopping by the window to look out at the fading afternoon light, and he finds out Rossi is filing a lien next week, I've committed corporate fraud by hiding a material liability during a receivership transfer. I go to prison. The silence in the room was heavier than before. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a trap. And Theodore had locked the jaws around my ankle before he handed me the keys. Get some sleep, Edmund said quietly. You have to be at the flagship at 5 in the morning. You can't fight Rossi, Arthur, and your sister if you drop dead on the prep line. He was right. I set an alarm and lay down, but I didn't sleep. I watched the shadows shift across the ceiling, running food cost percentages and vendor invoices through my head until the numbers blurred into a meaningless gray static. Monday morning at 5 a.m., the air in the alley behind the flagship was damp and smelled of old rain and bleach. I unlocked the heavy metal back door. The kitchen was dark, the stainless steel surfaces catching the ambient street light filtering through the high frosted windows. I reached out and flipped the main breaker. The fluorescent lights hummed to life with a harsh, staggered flicker. The lowboy refrigerators purred. The massive exhaust hood sat silent, waiting for the line to fire up. I tied a clean apron around my waist. I was the executive chef. I was the CEO. But right now, I was the only person in the building, and the prep list for a Monday service didn't care about corporate titles. At 5:30 a.m., the back door groaned open. Marcus walked in, holding a massive thermos of coffee. He stopped in the doorway, staring at me. I was at the center island, breaking down 2 whole sides of Scottish salmon, my knife sliding clean along the rib bones. Chef, Marcus said, his voice cautious. He hadn't called me chef in in 5 years. Not since Theodore bought his first monogrammed coat. Morning, Marcus, I said, not looking up from the fish. The walk-in temperature logs are updated. The compressor on the guard manger station was fixed yesterday afternoon. I need you to pull the short ribs for the braise and get the stock pot boiling. We're 86ing the duck confit entirely. Theodore's recipe is too high on food cost, and the yield is garbage. We're swapping it for a pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction. I printed the new spec sheets and taped them to your station. Marcus walked over to the prep line, set his thermos down, and looked at the typed sheet taped to the stainless steel above his cutting board. He read it in silence. This is the 2023 menu, Marcus said softly. It's the menu that made a 22% profit margin and won us our second star, I corrected, using my tweezers to pull the pin bones from the salmon fillet in rapid rhythmic succession. We're going back to basics. No more foam, no more smoke guns, just perfect execution. By 6 a.m., the rest of the prep crew filtered in. There was a palpable tension in the room. They had all heard the rumors. They knew Vivian and Theodore were gone, and they knew the payroll was supposed to hit tomorrow. They moved quietly, stealing glances at me as I moved between the stations, checking the hydration of the pasta dough, adjusting the acidity in the vinaigrette purely by watching how the oil suspended in the vinegar. At 8:30 a.m., the front of house manager, a sharply dressed woman named Elena, poked her head into the kitchen. Nora, Elena said, her eyes wide. There are 3 men in suits sitting in the main dining room. They said they have a 9 o'clock meeting with the owner. That's Martin, his boss, I said, wiping my hands on a side towel. And probably their regional credit director. Set them up at table 4. Give them sparkling water. Don't offer coffee. No coffee, Elena frowned. I'm going to make the coffee, I said. I walked over to the dry storage and pulled out a bag of the single origin espresso beans we reserve for VIPs. I ground them fresh, the sharp, bitter aroma cutting through the smell of the veal stock simmering on the stove. I didn't just bring them coffee. I grabbed a small, heavy carbon steel pan and threw it on a high flame. I cracked 6 farm fresh eggs into a metal bowl, beating them with a wire whisk until they were entirely uniform, a pale liquid gold. I dropped a tablespoon of unsalted butter into the pan. As soon as the foaming subsided, I poured in the eggs. I didn't use a spatula. I used the rapid jerking motion of my wrist, shaking the pan violently back and forth over the flame while stirring the center with a fork. In 15 seconds, the curd set tiny, delicate, and custard-like. I tapped the handle of the pan, rolling the omelet over itself into a perfect pale yellow cylinder. No brown spots. Total unblemished perfection. I slid it onto a warmed white plate, hit it with a pinch of flaky sea salt and a microshave of fresh black truffle, and walked out into the dining room. The 3 men at table 4 stopped talking as I approached. Martin looked deeply uncomfortable. The older man next to him, who I recognized as Richard, the VP of Regional Distribution, looked at my stained apron with barely concealed skepticism. I set the plate down in the center of the table. I placed 3 forks next to it, then set down a French press of the espresso. Good morning, Richard. Martin, I said, taking the empty chair opposite them. I know Vivian told you my palate was compromised. I know you're concerned about the brand's viability. Eat that. Then we'll talk about the credit line. Richard stared at the omelet. It was a classic French technique, a dish that separates line cooks from actual chefs. It requires absolute temperature control. If you leave it on the heat for 3 seconds too long, it turns rubbery. If your butter isn't right, it tastes greasy. He picked up a fork and cut into the center. The inside was a perfect bavouze, soft creamy, just barely set. He took a bite. He didn't say anything for a long time. He chewed slowly, looking out the massive plate glass windows at the morning traffic. Then he put the fork down, reached into his suit jacket, and pulled out a gold pen. Martin told me you wired $20,000 this morning, Richard said, his voice raspy. It cleared an hour ago, I said. That covers the past due balance and the advance for tomorrow's delivery. Going forward, you will deal exclusively with me. Theodore is no longer authorized to sign checks. Vivian is no longer authorized to place orders. If they call you, hang up. Richard looked at the omelet again. The industry runs on gossip, Nora. The word on the street is that Arthur Sterling is gutting this place. He's a liquidator. Why should I extend a 90-day credit line to a company that might not be here in 60? Because Arthur Sterling doesn't know how to cook a truffle omelet, I said evenly. I hold 51% voting control. I hold the menus, the staff. Arthur wants his money back. The only way he gets it is if my kitchens stay open. I need your truck at my loading docks on Tuesday and Thursday, just like always. Standard net 30 terms. Richard picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and sighed, net 14. For the next 2 months. Until you prove the cash flow is stable. Deal. I shook his hand, watched them leave, and immediately felt the brief surge of victory curdle in my stomach. I had bought time with the produce and dry goods, but it didn't matter if the truck showed up on Thursday if Vincent Rossi seized the liquor license on Friday. I checked my phone. It was 9:45 a.m. Arthur Sterling had requested a meeting at 10 light. He arrived precisely on the hour, stepping out of a black car at the curb. He wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him, carrying thick leather briefcases, his forensic accountants. Arthur walked into the empty dining room, his expensive shoes echoing on the hardwood. He looked at the empty tables, the pristine white tablecloths, the polished silver. He looked like a man evaluating a corpse for organ donation. The bridge loan is in the account, Arthur said by way of greeting. Your staff gets paid tomorrow. The meat vendor is whole. The immediate bleeding has stopped. Thank you, Arthur. He sat down at table 4, gesturing for his accountants to take the adjacent booth. Don't thank me. You bought yourself 60 days. Now, my team is going to spend the rest of the week tearing through the physical filing cabinets in Theodore's office. We found the digital fraud, but men like your brother always keep a paper trail of their worst mistakes. It makes them feel important. My pulse hammered against my ribs. A paper trail, the promissory note with Rossi, wasn't in the digital ledger. Sarah found it in a physical safe at the house, which meant the original copy, or a duplicate, might be sitting in Theodore's law filing cabinet right now. If Arthur's accountants found it before I told him, I was done. He would see it as a deliberate concealment. I sat down across from him. I placed my hands flat on the table so he wouldn't see a tremor. Arthur, I said, call your accountants off the filing cabinet. Arthur's gray eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Excuse me? You don't need to dig for Theodore's worst mistake, I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. I already found it. Arthur stared at me. He didn't blink. He just stapled his fingers together and waited. I reached into my apron pocket, pulled out the folded printout of the PDF Clara had sent me, and slid it across the white tablecloth. Theodore took out a $300,000 private loan 4 months ago, I said, forcing the words out before my throat could close up. He didn't run it through the corporate account. He took it as a personal cash injection and used it to pay the Midtown lease and cover his own embezzlement tracks. Arthur picked up the paper. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned efficiency of a man who read contracts for a living. I watched his jaw tighten, just a fraction. But for Arthur Sterling, that was the equivalent of a scream. Vincent Rossi, Arthur read aloud. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He collateralized his note with the flagship's liquor license. Yes. Arthur placed the paper carefully back on the table. He looked at me, his pale eyes completely dead. You knew about this yesterday when you signed the receivership documents, he stated. I found out yesterday afternoon, I corrected. After I signed. Clara found it in their home safe and emailed it to me. This note matures in 10 days, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Do you know who Vincent Rossi is, Nora? He's a predatory lender. He is a scavenger who operates on the absolute ragged edge of the law. Arthur snapped, his composure finally cracking. He leaned forward. He targets distressed hospitality assets, traps the owners in high-interest balloon payments, and then seizes their licenses to force a fire sale of the property. If he files a lien on this license, the State Beverage Control Board will suspend your right to serve alcohol. This dining room will be dead in 48 hours. I know. You don't have $300,000, Arthur said. And I am not throwing another cent of my firm's capital into a sinkhole created by your idiot brother to pay off a loan shark. I'm not asking you to pay it. Then what exactly is your plan, Nora? Because right now the receivership you just inherited is legally obligated to satisfy this debt or lose its primary revenue driver. If that license goes, I will trigger the liquidation clause instantly. I will sell the Midtown and East Wing locations to a fast casual chain just to recoup my initial investment, and I will shut this flagship down. I looked at the piece of paper on the table. Theodore's signature looked funny. Rushed. He had signed away our father's life work because he was too much of a coward to admit he was failing. I'm going to meet with Rossi, I said. Arthur let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're going to negotiate with Vincent Rossi? With what leverage? He holds a legally binding contract signed by the former acting CEO. Theodore signed it as the acting CEO, yes, I said, leaning forward to meet Arthur's gaze. But the liquor license isn't held by the corporate entity, Arthur. It's held by the family trust. Father set it up that way 15 years ago to protect it from exactly this kind of corporate liability. Arthur frowned, his legal mind quickly trying to catch up to the technicality. The trust requires unanimous consent from all active beneficiaries to pledge its assets as collateral, I finished. Theodore didn't have unanimous consent. Vivian didn't know about this loan, and neither did Ashford, and I certainly didn't sign off on it. Theodore door towards the board resolution he gave to Rossi. Arthur stared at me. If you prove fraud, the lien is invalid. Yes, but proving it in court takes 6 months, I said. By the time a judge throws the contract out, the state will have suspended our operations, and we'll be bankrupt anyway. Rossi knows this. He relies on the slow grind of the legal system to choke his victims out. So you go to him with the proof of the forgery, Arthur reasoned, his eyes narrowing. And you threaten to go to the district attorney. No, I said softly. Rossi doesn't care about the district attorney. He has better lawyers than the state. If I threaten him, he'll just file the lien early out of spite. I'm not going to threaten him with the law. I stood up from the table, picking up the printout and folding it back into my apron. I'm going to offer him a trade, I said. Arthur stared at me, the silence in the dining room stretching so tight it felt like the plate glass windows might shatter. A trade, he repeated, with Vincent Rossi. You are out of your depth, Nora. No, I said, picking up the printout. I was out of my depth when I was trying to manage my siblings' egos. This is just math. I didn't wait for Arthur to try and talk me out of it. I left him sitting at table 4 and walked back into the kitchen. I went into the small glass-walled manager's office, shut the door, and looked up Vincent Rossi's corporate office number. I didn't call the cell phone listed on the promissory note. I called the main distribution hub in the Bronx. When the receptionist answered, I didn't ask for a favor. I said I was the CEO of the Vance Hospitality Group and I was calling to settle Theodore Vance's collateralized debt. I had a meeting set for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Rossi's operation wasn't some cinematic smoke-filled backroom. It was a massive, brutally refrigerated warehouse complex on the Roper Expressway. The smell of raw beef ozone and industrial bleach was overwhelming. I was led up a flight of metal grate stairs to a glass-walled office overlooking the cutting floor. Vincent Rossi was in his 50s, wearing a tailored navy suit with a heavy tweed vest over it to fight the chill of the building. He didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a private equity manager who worked 70-hour weeks. He didn't offer me a seat. Theodore said he was the first to make the delivery, Rossi said, his voice flat. He said you were on permanent medical leave. Theodore's a lot of things, I said. I pulled the PDF printout and the first page of the forensic audit from my bag and laid them flat on his desk. He also said he had the legal right to pledge the flagship's liquor license as collateral. He didn't. The license is held by a family trust. It requires unanimous consent from all beneficiaries. Theodore forged the board resolution he gave you. Rossi looked at the paper, then at me. His expression didn't change, but the air in the office went dead still. If you came here to tell me my lien is invalid, you wasted a trip. I'll tie your restaurants up in civil court for 3 years. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you. I know, I said. And you'll spend a fortune in lawyer fees trying to collect on a forged document, only to watch my investor liquidate the real estate and leave you with nothing. It's a bad return on investment for both of us. Rossi leaned back in his leather chair. So why are you here? I'm here to offer you a better return, I said. Right now, you hold a toxic forged note for $300,000, but you're in the hospitality business. You like acquiring assets. My primary investor, Arthur Sterling, holds 30% of my group. He wants out. He's a liquidator, and he doesn't want to run kitchens. Buy him out. It will cost you $4 million. Rossi let out a short, harsh laugh. You want me to hand you $4 million because your brother owes me $300,000? You're insane. I want you to buy Arthur's 30% stake, I corrected. And in exchange for tearing up Theodore's forged note and not sending him to federal prison, I will force Theodore, Vivian, and Ashford to sign over their remaining 19% equity directly to you. They committed corporate fraud. I have the audit to strip their shares entirely. You walk away with 49% of a fully operational Michelin-starred restaurant group. I keep 51% voting control, and I run the kitchens. And you get an exclusive ironclad vendor contract to supply all premium proteins to all all 5 of our locations for the next 10 years. Rossi stopped laughing. He looked down at the cutting floor below, watching a crew of butchers break down hanging sides of beef. He was doing the math. He wanted clean, high-revenue businesses. He wanted guaranteed distribution routes for his meat. I was offering him a legitimate empire on a silver platter, completely sanitized, with a built-in buyer for his primary product. All he had to do was cut a check to Arthur and drop the grievance against my idiot brother. You keep 51%, Rossi murmured, turning back to me. I become a silent partner. You stay out of my kitchens, I said. You collect your profit share quarterly, and your delivery trucks show up on time. Rossi looked at the forensic audit on his desk. He tapped it with a heavy gold pen. Get Sterling's lawyers on the phone. Let's see if he wants to sell. It took 4 days to draft the paperwork. Arthur Sterling didn't care where the $4 million came from, as long as it hit his firm's escrow account. He signed the exit papers without a hint of sentimentality, shook my hand, and walked out of my life. The harder meeting was on Friday morning. I asked Theodore, Vivian, and Ashford to come to the flagship restaurant. The dining room was empty. The chairs still stacked on the tables from the night years. I sat at table 4, the exact spot where I had cooked the omelet for the vendors. Rossi's lead attorney sat next to me with a stack of transfer documents. When my siblings walked in, they looked exhausted. Theodore had dark circles under his eyes. Vivian was clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Ashford just looked small. I slid the documents across the table. What is this? Vivian asked, her voice sharp but brittle. This is your exit, I said. I placed the forged promissory note next to the transfer papers. Theodore physically recoiled when he saw it. Vincent Rossi was going to file a lien on the liquor license on Monday, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of pity. He was going to take the flagship, and when he found out he forged the trust resolution, Theodore, he was going to go to the district attorney. You were facing 5 to 8 years for wire fraud and passing a forged instrument. Theodore dropped into a chair. He put his head in his hands. He didn't argue. He knew exactly what he had done. I made a deal with him, I continued. Arthur is gone. Rossi bought him out. And to settle your $300,000 debt, you are signing over your remaining 19% of the company to Rossi. All 3 of you. Your equity is gone. Your minority shares are gone. You own 0% of this company. Vivian stared at me, her face pale. You gave our company to a meat distributor? You gave away father's legacy? No, Vivian, I said. I saved father's legacy for you. Sign the papers, or Rossi's lawyer makes a phone call, and the police put Theodore up at his house before lunch. It was completely quiet in the dining room. There was no screaming. There was no grand speech. The fight had been bled out of them completely. Ashford signed first, his hand trembling as he scratched his name across the line. Then Vivian, her signature an angry, jagged slash across the bottom of the page. Theodore didn't even read the terms. He just signed his name, stood up, and walked out the front door without looking back. Vivian lingered for a second. She looked around the dining room, at the crystal chandeliers, the polished mahogany bar. She looked at me. I expected venom, but there was only a hollow, terrifying emptiness in her eyes. She had finally realized that the world she thought she controlled had never actually belonged to her. She turned and walked out. I sat alone in the dining room for a long time. The paperwork was signed. The debt was cleared. The payroll had hit the accounts on Tuesday. The vendors were paid. I owned 51% of the band's hospitality group, and for the first time in a decade, there was no one standing over my shoulder telling me I was broken. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and tied my apron on. Friday night service was in Sheen. Rossi's first delivery of dry-aged ribeyes had arrived that morning, and the marbling was spectacular. At 7:30 p.m., the ticket machine was spitting a continuous rhythm of orders. The heat was oppressive, heavy with the smell of rendered fat, roasting garlic, and reduction sauces. I stood at the pass. Marcus slid a pan-seared duck on top of the plate of the counter. I checked the temperature of the meat with a gentle press of my tongs. It was flawless. I spooned the dark, glossy cherry cream over the top, watching how it cooled, perfectly viscous, catching the harsh taste of the kitchen. Table 12, I called out, wiping the rim of the plate with a linen towel. Edmund walked into the kitchen from the alley door a few minutes later, holding a box of fresh sourdough bowls from his bakery for the dinner service. He set them down on the prep table and walked over to the pass. He bumped his shoulder against mine, a quiet, solid anchor in the middle of the chaos. How does it feel, he asked, shout meat to be heard over the roar of the exhaust fan. I looked down the line. I saw my cooks moving with purpose, listening to my calls, trusting my eyes. I couldn't taste the salt, the acid, or the heat, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what I had built. It feels like home, I said. I turned back to the board, pulled the next ticket, and called the fire.